Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast.
Now back to Studio A and the award-winning Scott Michlin morning program on KSJE.
My guest on the program this morning, back for his regular visit, of course, archaeologist Paul Reed, who works with Archaeology Southwest. He's done a lot of work up here in the area, of course, at Salmon Ruins and Aztec Ruins, and gosh, any ruins you can think of, I imagine, have a little bit of Paul's fingerprints on them. Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Scott. So glad to be back on with you.
Thank you for joining us again this morning to talk a bit about your continued work, of course, in the Southwest, and the work of Archaeology Southwest, of course, which is who you work for. And this month, we're going to be talking about another site near and dear to your heart. I know you've spent a lot of time in the El Malpais part of New Mexico, yes?
Yes, correct. I've been really fortunate, Scott, to have worked down in El Malpais National Monument just south of Grants, New Mexico, now for 20 years. So been out there about every second or third year doing different types of archaeological projects or landscape-oriented work.
Yeah. And this is an area, again, we were trying to talk about how it's to describe it. And of course, as you mentioned to me, it's right near Grants, New Mexico. If you travel along I-40 between Gallup and Albuquerque, or Albuquerque and Gallup, you're driving through kind of those lava fields that are part of this wide area, right?
Right, correct. As you go through, just literally between the exits that define Grants, there are piles of really rough-looking lava. That's from the McCarty's flow, which is the most recent one in the area from about, 1000 BCE, like 3,000 years ago.
Right.
So a lot of the work we've done has been going into and sort of around and through the McCarty's. So it's a landscape that you earn the right, shall we say, to be in it.
Yeah, sure. But it looks pretty inhospitable, as it were. And so it's amazing to talk with you and a little bit about some of your work there and what you've been discovering. And there's a survey out from Archaeology Southwest, which is what we're going to be kind of talking about this morning, about this area.
Right. Again, we've been fortunate to partner with the National Park Service folks, archaeologist Claire Norton in this case, at the monument. And Claire came up with an idea to look at a specific landform, zone, if you will, in the lava, the Kipukas, which of course is a Hawaiian term. A lot of our lava-based terms come from very active study of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. And the Kipukas are islands of basically unlavaed land, if I can create that term.
Okay, right.
In the midst of these lava flows. The lava flows come through, and when you have high spots, they can be mesas, they can be, even just other areas that are geographically blocked, topographically blocked. So the lava literally flowed around, the magma did, and then it settles, and then you still have these zones. So this is something that Claire has been interested in. She's been there a couple of years at the monument, and basically engaged Archaeology Southwest to go out with some of our Pueblo partners, which is something I want to talk a little bit about as well, to get into the Kipukas and kind of see what the landscape looked like and see what the archaeological and the cultural pattern is.
Right. And so in this vast area, there are hundreds of these, thousands of these?
No, the Kipukas number in kind of the low dozens,
okay.
I would say. Yeah, so the monument as a whole is roughly 116,000 acres, just to give folks some sense. Chaco's about 35,000 acres. So we're looking at an area about 3 times the size of Chaco. Again, sort of arrayed from north near the Grant side going south down a couple of the different highways, the highway that goes out to Zuni and the highway that goes to Quemado, that kind of frames this area. And the Kipukas can be from, a house, basically a house site size, half acre to an acre, all the way up to some of the larger ones that I think are approaching 10 acres.
Okay.
But they're a pretty unique landform, again, within kind of this very these massive flows of lava.
Right. And so with that, and I know we're probably going to get there too, but there's evidence obviously of some habitation or some traveling through these areas. I imagine it's more difficult to travel across the lava flows, the former lava flows, right? That's not very easy on feet or hide or whatever, right?
Right. And I think, in my time out there, that's one of the things that has been fairly amazing to me, going through the process of looking at different areas. As I mentioned, we've been fortunate to work out there for about 20 years. So I've been able personally to be in pretty much every corner of the monument, deep inside, kind of on the margins. And there are archaeological, historic sites, cultural sites, really in what I would say is surprising frequency, just a whole lot of them. And a big portion of this is focused on trails. So we have a number of defined trails that get in and out of the monument, that cross different portions of it. There's a well-known trail that the Park Service developed a few decades ago called, if you're on the west side, the Zuni-Yakima Trail. If you're on the east side, the Yakima-Zuni Trail. But this is about a 7-mile trail that goes all the way through the lava. Is very popular. The other thing is the Continental Divide Trail, which goes from Mexico to Canada, passes through our state, of course, because we are on the divide. And so portions of that trail come through and connect briefly with the Zuni-Yakima Trail. So anyway, what we have found through, these many years of work is a number of trails and trail segments that were carefully developed by the folks in the past. They mark them with rock piles or cairns that you can see, from some distance. In some cases, they put stones in to fill areas that, would have been dangerous cracks to step over. They use some of the flat lava to pave. So really just a great deal of time and attention went in to building trails to get into different places. And as part of our work, we were fortunate, since we wanted to not necessarily focus a ton on the lava, but really get into these Kipuka areas and kind of see what they looked like. And these are open, just, to get a picture for folks, open grassy areas with normal soil development, sands and silts and everything. And the margins of the lava and the Kipukas we found were very interesting. But again, the trails were helpful for us because we started out trying to find trails, and it's a lot easier to get in and out of the lava. They call me Captain Obvious, right? It's a lot easier to get into these places with a well-developed trail that folks have been using for hundreds or thousands of years.
Right. And those were fairly easy to spot, or for a trained person like yourself and your colleagues?
Yeah, and we had just an amazing team of folks at, trail finding. And again, with the use of the rock cairns, this is something that gets talked about a lot in hiking circles, and, modern people tend to make rock piles, and this, is a source of irritation for different ones of us who want to just go out and enjoy landscapes. Well, the cairns mark trails going way, way back in time. I think the earliest I'm aware of are several thousand years. So in most cases, we were able to get on trails that had cairns that were, 15, 20 meters, 40, 50 feet apart, and was pretty easy to spot one to the next to avoid the different rough areas in the lava, either just literally piles of sort of fist-sized super sharp rocks, or the big depressions that form. When the lava rolls through, it'll bubble up in these kind of chambers. And then when the gases disperse, a lot of times the rocks collapse and you get big, they're like sinkholes that, the geology is very different from that. So you get these big holes, and then you have lava ridges going around them. And if you're trying to get in and out, you don't really want to go down into those. Certainly fun hiking if that's what you're about. So the trails tend to hit the high points between sort of the ridges, the collapsed areas, other lava tubes, and the other interesting thing about this landscape is there's a myriad of little tiny caves and collapsed lava tubes, and some larger cave or shelter type places that, were of use in the past.
Yeah, interesting. And of course, the map that we're showing right now on the screen is showing the kind of the survey area that you were working in, maybe, right? And it looks like maybe about 7 of these spots in the in the area.
Yeah. Our goal on this project, working with our Park Service partner, Claire Norton, was to sample about 20 of them. So And we did field work beginning in March, kind of hoping to escape, the heat, which can be, sort of challenging for us in our Four Corners environment, no matter what. But in the lava, the heat particularly can get overbearing because the black rock, of course, absorbs a lot of the solar radiation. So we got out, about 2 months ago now, and we managed to get most of that sample of 20 looked at. And there's a little bit more wrap-up work. But yeah, it was really a tremendous, very interesting project.
Got you. Interesting. And so, what do we think? What do we think we know about the people that maybe lived here or were hunted here or hunted for their food and survival and things like that? Or what period of time are we talking about?
Well, one of the real interesting things about this landscape, across the whole 116,000 plus acre monument, is that we have sites that go way back, thousands of years. I believe there is one way early component that's more than 10,000 years old. There's evidence of folks during this kind of large period that archaeologists have labeled as archaic. And then there is substantial occupation by Pueblo groups and by Navajo Dene groups in certain spots of the lava. So in these areas that we looked at, in particular the bigger Kipukas, we found a number of Pueblo dwelling sites. So places where folks went through the full process to build Pueblos, to hunt, to farm, either on the mesa top or in areas down below. So, at least for a period of time that, is a little hard to pin down, at least a couple of decades or more, we had a pretty substantial commitment of people. And, given the proximity of the monument to Acoma Pueblo on the east and then Zuni Pueblo on the west, it's likely that the folks in and out of the lava living for periods of time were linked to the folks, who live in Zuni and Acoma Pueblo today. So, knowing that, of course, and knowing that the monument had established relationships with the tribal groups that are very close to the boundaries, and, given the work that I had done with Archaeology Southwest and other projects with tribal members, we set out to bring as many tribal folks out as we could, and that part was really just great. So we had representatives from Zuni Pueblo, from Acoma Pueblo, and from the Pueblo Powaki, closer to my neck of the woods here on the Rio Grande.
Right.
And, folks were out with us for most of the time, making discoveries, so sharing some traditional knowledge from the Pueblo side, and also sort of, interacting with us as we did sort of our archaeological stuff, looking at sites, trying to figure out what we were seeing on the ground, looking at artifacts, taking photographs, drawing maps, kind of the whole suite of things.
I see. Sure. And so I guess not a lot of structures out here, right, that you could see, or?
Well, what was really interesting is, the largest Kipuka we looked at, which, again, is in that 7, 8, 9 acre size, had 3 or 4 different small Pueblo dwellings. So we're talking about sites with between 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe as many as 10 rooms, with substantial deposits of refuse, indicating a commitment to years and probably a couple of decades there. So that was in part, I think, surprising that far inside the lava, we had a commitment for folks to build permanent structures. Some of the smaller Kipukas sort of manifested, artifact scatters, some projectile points, arrow points or spear points indicating hunting activities, some scatters of, different pieces of broken pottery and ceramics. So really a very interesting mix. And based on sort of what we knew from, the records of the monument and the work that's been done there, just, for the more recent time scale, the monument was declared in 1987. So it's going to hit 40 years next year. And in the late 90s, Park Service, got the funding and went through a process to sample survey, archaeologically, culturally different parts of the park, and then we've added to that with different projects over the 20 years. So we have we're starting to get an idea of what, we think, at least from the archaeological side, is going on out there. And the prior work had showed that some of these Kipukas did have substantial presence of Pueblo people during certain time periods. I think we're looking, a variety of periods, but sort of a concentration from, say, 950, 975 to about 1100 or a little after. So some overlap with what we would think of, further to the north as sort of prime time, Chaco era.
Right.
And, some signs of connection to Chaco, and certainly indications that folks also have connections to the south. So anyway, just some very interesting findings. And,
Sure.
for those decades, a pretty substantial commitment to folks being in the lava and choosing to live there, which is remarkable for another reason. That when the lava came through, again, the most recent about 1000 BCE, it no doubt disrupted whatever stream flow patterns existed in the area. So today there's no drainage really in or out of the lava, in the form of surface water. So, and of course we have, Pueblo and other indigenous sites all over the Southwest, not always in positions that archaeologists or modern, people would say, oh, this is a great spot. There's a creek right here. So what's interesting to me is the folks that did commit to going in there, for that number of decades, were able to secure the water resources necessary to build their homes and to farm and, to basically live as, Pueblo people have told us, and my understanding with the archaeology of doing Pueblo work now for a few decades, to make their living in a spot that looks today like it would be pretty water challenged. So that, again, just a particularly interesting finding.
Yeah, very much so. Again, showing a little bit of a photo from the area there of a water pocket, right on one of the sandstone outcroppings, I'm assuming, right? That
Right.
You would find maybe in one of these areas?
Yeah, so what we have is, where the sandstone occurs, in some cases, the lava rock can act as holding ponds. They're called tinajas, at least in Spanish, to indicate areas where the water stays. It may be that there are springs that were present in the area 1,000 years ago. There's not a whole lot that show up, and looking at sort of the modern data, the modern hydrological data. So I think a lot of what made this successful was, patterns of rainfall. And we know from looking at tree ring records for the region and for more specific areas that there were definitely decades in the 900s and the 10,000s or 1,000s where there was substantial water coming from the sky. So,
Sure.
And, as master water managers, that's really what allowed Pueblo people in those periods to, make a living in here.
Right. And so, pardon me for going backwards a little bit, Paul, Reed, but the structures that you have found, again, compared to what we're familiar with maybe at Salmon ruins or Aztec ruins, these are certainly much, much smaller, right, than those, and much smaller populations. Whomever was staying there or using those structures, whether it was a permanent or occasional space, I guess.
Right. So they're not building, in the Kipukas, sites that probably exceed 10, 12, maybe 15 rooms. What's interesting, though, is just right outside some of the areas we looked at, there are larger sites. So I think, just if my memory serves well, for the monument as a whole, there's one very large Pueblo site that's between 80 and 100 rooms at a site called Las Ventanas, which is out on the edge of the lava on the east side, so not too far from Acoma lands, and pretty close to a prominent arch that is called La Ventana, sort of a window rock shaped arch that gives the site its name. And this site was connected to Chaco with patterns in the masonry and some of the ceramics and other items. We did a little study at Las Ventanas, about 15 years ago now. So there are substantial Pueblo populations, or there were, in these zones, not necessarily inside the Kipukas. So it's certainly reasonable to infer that these groups were connected to each other and knew each other, and that perhaps the folks who chose to go into the Kipukas, in the 900s or early 1000s to do their thing, to make their living, kind of were trying to branch into a new area and see how that went. And based on what we saw, that was pretty successful for them, because the sites that the crews were looking at had substantial evidence of people being there. So in other words, we're not just seeing a little masonry room on the ground and maybe a broken pot, but we're seeing a whole lot of artifacts, animal bone, lots and lots of broken pottery of multiple types, different lithic and stone tools. So,
Yeah.
a real commitment again, at least for that time period.
Right. And I guess, would you describe it maybe as an outpost, or is that not a correct term, or still maybe unknown as to how these things were used in comparison to the larger settlements that you talked about at Acoma and Zuni?
Yeah, I think it would, given the geography of it, I think, Scott, it's reasonable to infer that the groups there had linkages and connections.
Okay.
In the time period of the 900 and the 1000s, there's settlement in Zuni, certainly, and settlement at Acoma, but the large Pueblos really weren't built until later in time in the 1100s, 1200s, and beyond. So these groups could probably be seen as potentially, feeder groups that would eventually then coalesce at the bigger places, east and west. And, it's fairly difficult, even with some of the very good oral history we have, looking at populations and the way people move around, to say this group is definitely linked to this group historically, because I think, as we've talked on the show, sort of the big group of Pueblo material culture, with the way they're using stone, the way they're making pottery, the way they're making textiles, their building techniques, their farming techniques, all those things fit into a fairly distinctive series of material classes. And what we describe in archaeology, at least, as material culture. But we can't really detect differences in linguistics or social organization. So we kind of have to try and infer other clues. And then we generally try to talk about it a little more broadly and say that these groups were likely ancestral to some of the larger population aggregations and gatherings that emerged. But it's certainly possible that a group migrated in from a more distant area, kind of in the Pueblo world, tried their hand, as it were, at making a living in the Malpais, and then decided at some point, this is perhaps not what we want, and, left and joined other groups somewhere else. So, what my Pueblo colleagues and friends tell me is, Pueblo people move. Migration is huge, and that movement is built into the way they view themselves and the way they view the ancestral past, with, frequent movement to basically sustain their lifestyles.
Right. Interesting. But again, still more, I guess, evidence of human activity than you were expecting. At least that's what this report says.
Yeah. And more, I would say, more substantial and intensive for some of these time periods. And, we're fairly newly out of the field, so, we'll continue to do work on this. My colleague, Ben Peltier, who I'll have on a future show, when some of this is maybe a little more clear and we can talk, in a little more summary fashion about it, Ben will come on. But so he's heading up the project. And the idea, of course, is to look at the Kipukas and then see how what we think we've learned, what our Pueblo partners out the field have learned, to build a report and then see how that sort of interacts with the work that's been done previously. So, it's, as you know, Scott, it's an iterative process. We add a piece, we try to see where it fits in, we pull in new classes of data, and for me, the thing that made this project so exciting was, number one, looking at an area in the Kipukas at Malpais that had never really been systematically looked at, and to have our Pueblo compadres, partners, and friends out helping us see the landscape and understand this very interesting, complicated landscape through, different sets of eyes with different perspectives. So that, this really is the kind of collaborative project that I have wanted to do and have thought about for a few years. So
yeah,
just very, very fulfilling to have that happen.
Right. Very cool. Well, and again, I'm sitting here going, it's amazing that this area that seems to be kind of not too far off the beaten path, but I know there are areas that are certainly remote for sure, but that, this is maybe one of the first major studies of it. Now, do we think, did you see evidence that maybe other archaeologists had been through there, even back in like the 1930s or 40s or 20s, as we talk about some of these expeditions here in New Mexico, like around Aztec or Salmon and things like that? Or is this pretty much untouched as far as you could tell?
Well, it's interesting because, again, the Kipukas, some awareness from monument staff and on a project they started over 25, almost 30 years ago. They were doing that. What we know from sort of the big sites, what we might refer to as a Chaco outlier, a Chaco affiliated site, to the east at Las Ventanas, that site was visited by Adolphe Bandelier. I think it was in 1882. So there's a record of that.
Okay.
And Bandelier got around to a lot of different places, not just the National Monument that bears his name to this day. And, he was a pretty good observer, wrote a lot of notes. So we have an initial description of the Great House site at Las Ventanas, and then a Great Kiva structure as well. So, so this site has, this area has a bit of a historical pedigree, if we want to talk about it that way. And then kind of as you go down the road, the western road is New Mexico Highway 53 that goes into Zuni. You pass through El Moro, which of course, has amazing inscriptions that go way back in time, way back to indigenous rock imagery, and then through a whole lot of different explorers leaving, signatures, etc. And Bandelier did a little bit of work there at a good size Zuni site called Atsina. So we definitely have those linkages to the historical past, if you will.
Sure. But again, no evidence necessarily here where you were. And does that,
No.
Is that somewhat more exciting for you in your line of work to be able to look at these sites and say, wow, I may be the first archaeologist who's been here?
Yeah, it's definitely fun to get into areas and realize that some of the work is, hopefully going to help lay a good foundation for understanding. Because one of the I think one of the useful focuses and functions of archaeology is to understand not just the distant past but the more recent past. So occasionally I've worked in places where a lot of archaeologists have gone through, and an archaeological site or location might have been recorded 10 or 15 times. So that can be a challenging process, because then you have the maps from the previous archaeologist folks, and you go, okay, here's their map. They saw this. I'm not seeing that, and of course sites change through time, right? Rainfall patterns change, erosion can increase, deposition can increase. So the sites don't look the same, perhaps from year to year, but if you go 5 years and go back, and I've gone to places on the Malpais National Monument, even 10 years after initial work, and been pretty blown away by how different they look. And it's also about season, right? If you're in the spring, there's a lot of green plants that aren't there. If it's been a real dry year, those dry up and you get different looks. So it is an interesting process. I call sort of the decoding of other people's archaeological work archaeology of the very recent past.
Right.
And again, that can have its frustrations, but it's also fairly satisfying in some ways to wonder about sites that had been recorded or logged either historically or in the more recent past, and then be able to kind of solve some of those documentation mysteries and then move forward going, okay, we know what's been done out here from 100 plus years ago, and we know what's been done over 30 years. And now we have a fairly good and hopefully comprehensive record leading to a better understanding. And again, this is where our Indigenous colleagues are very helpful too, because, on several of the sites that we visited and worked on, our Pueblo colleagues were looking at things and saying, well, this is what we're seeing here. And so that only increases our understanding, and hopefully, allows us to just better understand the past. And if we're in a situation where we're trying to protect places for either from natural or modern cultural things, all that knowledge is very helpful.
Yeah, very much so. Well, and I imagine it's great for them to be able to tag along and hear what you are interpreting. And as you have taught us in our conversations, the stories are evolving and always subject to change as new evidence comes to light, and you follow the science, and that's kind of where things go. And this is just another chapter in that evolving story, it sounds like to me, and more to come.
Right. Exactly, Scott. And it really is part of what Archaeology Southwest and what I personally am, very excited about in terms of expanding archaeology and getting our Indigenous colleagues into much closer contact with their ancestral places and giving them a much more active role in managing their own past heritage.
Nice. Very good. Well, do you think we'll be hearing more then about this study and more, visits out there to do some more field work?
Yeah, we have some wrap-up type field work. We have another project we're doing for the monument, which is a cultural landscape report. I've talked in the past on the show about one we did for Malpais National Monument. So this is a similar project, and, we're a year or so into that. So there'll definitely be more to say. And by the fall, I think we'll have a pretty good report finished. So I'll come back on, and I'd like to, bring my project director, Ben Peltia, and, one or two of our Pueblo colleagues who want to come on.
Yeah.
Sort of have a discussion of, just what this project means and, what we think we have learned.
That'd be great. I will look forward to that very, very much, Paul Reed. And you're just the guy to do it because you've got all those numbers in your Rolodex, and kids have to ask your grandparents what a Rolodex is.
That's right.
But appreciate your time, Paul, as always. Thank you so much for sharing this with us this morning. It's been really interesting.
Well, thank you, Scott. I'm thrilled to be on the show, and to all those Chaco fans, we will talk about Chaco again in the future. But nice to expand our focus and look at a very interesting area. And again, within 2.5, 3 hours of Farmington, so well worth a visit.
Yeah, very true. A very unique spot for sure. So good to share it with our audiences. So wonderful. Well, Paul, thanks so much. We will see you next time. And again, we always appreciate your time very, very much. That is Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest, my guest this morning right here on KSJE. Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.